Earlier, we mentioned that there are often outside forces that affect local populations. And we know that the Chinese government has made a significant investment throughout Africa, both in some cases through infrastructure, in many cases through mineral extraction. This has the echoes of a lot of colonial activity from Western nations in the past. From what you've seen and what you've reported on, the folks you're talking to, um, are you seeing history repeat itself here, or do you feel like there's a chance that maybe this time will be different?
Um, yes, that's such a good question. I think from my own research and interviews, it is history repeating itself. Um, in the DRC, for example, mines that have been created by Chinese companies have been also found to be mines that have some of the worst human rights abuses, um, also underpaid workers, for example, and mine expansions that can often be reported to be made by Chinese companies mean forced displacement, or means that local communities who live around these mines are suffering from air pollution and respiratory illnesses. And oftentimes these exchanges come at a cost. It's not done out of charitable means. And I think it's important to understand why that's happening. If China is coming into these countries and it's at an agreement that can often benefit them more than the African country itself, then it is reminiscent of colonialism, which is why oftentimes when African activists, climate activists talk about that, they talk about it in terms of neo-colonialism.
Are there other countries? I mean, we hear about China, right? And they are one of the large, growing economies of the world. Are there other nations that are also engaged in similar practices that maybe are relative newcomers to the scene in Africa?
Um, from my research, not that I know of, but for example, there are a lot of transnational companies. For example, even oil companies. When we talk about Shell, that's Dutch owned, but also British involvement. And that there's a lot of companies, transnational companies involved, not always able to trace. For example, some of these companies are Canadian, for example. And again, because that supply chain is very blurred of how it was cultivated, these transnational companies aren't always able to be held to account if there is environmental devastation caused by natural resource extraction. And oftentimes we can attribute it to a corrupt government and not actually on the companies who are benefiting from this idea of corruption.